Hey everyone, I've been working for like 5 million years on a video called The Problem with Nonprofits, heavily influenced by the books
The revolution will not be funded. Beyond the nonprofit industrial complex by Insight, Women of Color Against Violence.
No Such Thing as a Free Gift, the Gates Foundation, and the Price of Philanthropy by Lindsay McGoey.
Winners Take All, the Elite Charade of Changing the World by Anand Giridharadas.
Decolonizing Wealth, Indigenous Wisdom to Heal Divides and Restore Balance by Edgar Villanueva.
Every time I work on the video, I hit points where I'm like, fuck, this one issue needs its own video. So, for example, I made a history of nonprofit corporatization, then how to unionize your workplace. Then, Bill Gates, king of neoliberalism. Then I got back on track with the original project. And guys, the first complete draft is almost done, but then I hit a point where I realized I really had to just make a takedown video about the
National Council of Nonprofits.
Because this graphic right here. Okay, first of all, what the fuck is it?
National Council of Nonprofits.
Well, it's a fucking nonprofit. One great way to learn about how a particular nonprofit works is to look up their 990 form on a place like ProPublica. So the CEO guy's name is Charles Delaney, but I guess he goes by Tim Delaney everywhere online. So he's some liberal lawyer guy who apparently took down some corrupt politicians in Arizona. Why am I even complaining about this? He pays himself a little over $300,000 a year to do CEO president stuff, and his 3 other staff get around $150,000 per year. And like, whatever, I guess it's not that much. I mean, I'm never going to make that kind of money, but so what does their organization do?
They advance the vital role, capacity, and voice of charitable nonprofits through state and national networks.
So they spent over $700,000 last year on public advocacy, which entails, God, this is so boring, just like little legislative defensive reforms and protections to make sure nonprofits can keep providing services related to like healthcare and education and I guess activism, but we need to talk about the activism thing real bad. They spent around $250,000 last year on a website and some newsletters and a blog and some webinar and like some fucking op-eds. I mean, is it fair to bitch about overpaid nonprofit CEOs when there's like Rex Tillerson or Jeff Bezos just running around buying islands to turn into pedophile sex dungeons or whatever the fuck they do with their GDP-sized checking accounts? I mean, I don't know. And like their 990 form doesn't disclose where their contributions come from, so it could be from just membership dues and small donations, but it could also be heavily influenced by big shitty corporations or like the Gates Foundation or something. We just don't have any info on this, so who fucking knows? But look, all that aside, Tim Delaney, the section on your website called
Myths About Nonprofits.
Myth. Nonprofits get most of their funding from foundations. Reality. Foundation grants represent only a small part of the total amount of dollars contributed each year to the charitable nonprofit community. Private philanthropy, which includes both donations and bequests from individuals and grants from private and corporate foundations, represents only 14% of the total annual revenue to the charitable nonprofit community. And of that, the majority is from contributions from individuals.
Okay, so let me just explain the overall graph real quick. So as you can see, the dollar, it's a very clever graphic where there's a single dollar that's broken into different pieces that indicates the amounts of money coming from different funding sources for the nonprofit sector. So the biggest chunk is the blue chunk, which is 49%, or that's like half of all nonprofits. They're saying are funded by private fees for services, and we'll get into what that is. Roughly a third come from government grants or contracts. About 9% comes from individuals. About 3% from foundations. 1.5 comes from bequests, which is like dead people or like people putting donations into their wills. And then about 1% corporations, and the 5.2% that's other, they don't explain that. But the overall message of the graphic is that half comes from fees for service, a third come from government grants. And so basically this area is the most significant in a way because like just look at like how much that it, like this is the vast majority, right? This is like 80%. And so this stuff, which is like rich individuals, rich foundations, rich people with bequests and corporations, there's only like 14% of the funding sources coming from wealthier people, as I would say the capitalist class. And so this amount doesn't really have necessarily very much influence on the nonprofit sector, because this is the stuff you need to pay attention to.
First, this big blue section is almost entirely just talking about hospitals and universities. Roughly half of all hospitals in the US are nonprofits, and basically all Ivy League universities are nonprofits. And in the other video, I'll get into how messed up the tax-exempt status can make these institutions based on how insanely high-priced their services are and the obscenely overbloated salaries they pay their executives. But even if we put that aside for now, we need to think also of what private fees for service actually means. Because when we talk about medical and educational services, we're talking about really expensive shit. Let's not forget that 1 in 5 Americans goes bankrupt due to medical debt, which means that as a result of the US being the only industrialized country on earth without a single-payer system, people's lives get destroyed by medical debt equally from both for-profit and non-profit healthcare providers. So you can't tell me that there's anything special or good about people paying out of pocket for healthcare. The other thing is college. Harvard is a nonprofit, Yale's a nonprofit, all the Ivy Leagues are nonprofits. So when super wealthy parents pay fees for service for a college tuition, it's because they've got millions to spare and it's not an issue. Or it's kids taking on decades of crippling student loan debt, which in many cases, like including mine, they may never be able to pay that back for the rest of their lives.
75% of borrowers who graduated from private, nonprofit colleges have student loan debt. Average student loan debt at private, nonprofit colleges is $32,300, which is 15% higher today than it was in 2008.
So that's the blue fucking square. Now on to the red. First, let's remind ourselves where government grants and contracts come from, taxes. And let's remind ourselves who pays taxes and who doesn't. It used to be rich people, then Ronald Reagan came along, and every Democrat since him hasn't done shit to reverse this completely batshit trend. It's what the kids call neoliberalism, guys. So we can look at this graph of the top marginal federal individual income tax rates from 1913 to 2017. You can see in the 60s the rates dropped significantly, but to hit Reagan's era it dropped insanely, and it hasn't gone anywhere back to what it used to be ever since. You know how in the movie Joker, which narratively took place during the early 1980s, his social worker tells him about those budget cuts? Spoiler alert.
They've cut our funding. We're closing down our offices next week. The city's cut funding across the board. Social services is part of that. This is the last time we'll be meeting. They don't give a shit about people like you, Arthur. And they really don't give a shit about people like me either.
When am I supposed to get my medication now? Who do I talk to?
I'm sorry, Arthur.
The Joker's caseworker was referring to actual budget cuts enacted by Ronald Reagan in 1981. It was roughly $35 billion in cuts, all of which went to social services, including mental hospitals, therapy, access to medication, low-income housing, public schools, transportation.
As part of the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981, consolidated 77 grants into 9 grants. The Reagan grants provided about 25% less funding than the programs they replaced. Thus, with new distribution formulas, some governmental units were double losers, receiving smaller shares of a smaller total of federal support.
Go talk to a nonprofit. I'm Batman.
Reagan condensed 77 block grants into 9 block grants. But the budget cuts also resulted in there being 25% less money in those grants. So there used to be 25% more money within the 77 grants, and then the amount of grants was broken down to only 9 with a quarter less of the money. Say these are grocery stores. You have 77 grocery stores. It's worse if you only have 9 grocery stores. There's 25% less food than there was in the 77 grocery stores. Now there's only 9, but each grocery store has 25% less food. What's going to happen? People are going to fucking starve. And now let's say that these are nonprofits. These nonprofits now have a vastly smaller pool of grant opportunities to apply to. But now all of a sudden, you have nonprofits angry at each other. They're competing with each other. And so now there's a very competitive culture between all these nonprofits who are going to try to become more professional seeming, have better success stories, have better metrics. They're going to have to hire more consultants. They're going to do all this shit to try to get the government grant money.
The capitalist state created a crisis that the nonprofit sector would predictably step in to try to solve, because good people tend to try to help when they recognize that people need help. But instead of the massive army of nonprofit workers figuring out how to revolt against the economic terrorists who put them in this situation, they did what nonprofits do best. They created a success story. This story was, and still is, the nonprofit sector fills in the gaps where government can't help. When Delaney, whose $300,000 a year salary puts him in the top 2 percentile of earners in America, and his other six-figure nonprofit executive colleagues use this graph to tell us that foundations don't influence nonprofits all that much, you really have to wonder why they're pushing this particular narrative. Lindsay McGoey, author of There's No Such Thing as a Free Gift, The Gates Foundation and the Rise of Philanthrocapitalism, writes on page 18 of her book,
charitable donations deprive treasuries of tax revenues that could be spent on redistributive welfare policies.
Just to have that sink in, because of the fact that these things don't get taxed, it's less tax money that goes here. But what we're going to focus on next is like, what do rich people donate their money to? Typically, in the nonprofit world, do they donate it to stuff that like helps out poor people and the disadvantaged and the marginalized, or whatever you want to call it?
The vast majority of charitable donations do not provide economic relief for low-income individuals. The annual 2012 Giving USA study reported that only 7% of the previous year's overall charitable donations in the nation reached programs defined as for public society benefit, in contrast to the much higher spending on religious and cultural pursuits. 55% of foundation arts grants in the U.S. go to organizations with budgets greater than $5 million, which represent less than 2% of the more than 100,000 arts and culture nonprofits in the nation. The primary audience for these institutions tends to be white and upper income.
When an individual commits $100 million of their business or other appreciated property to charity, the foregone taxes from the government are often far greater than the after-tax cost to the donor. Had the donor not given that $100 million, the donor would have had an additional tax liability of up to $66 million just based on the foregone capital gains tax and the savings from the income tax charitable deduction. If one adds in estate taxes, the tax savings may be as much as $75 million. Given the size of the tax subsidy, it's important to ask, what is society actually getting in return?
So honestly, what's even the point of talking about the blue and red bits of this graphic if you're not just trying to make people look away from the capitalist class? And honestly, here's what happens if you look away. You don't see shit like this.
Massive new study traces how corporations use charitable donations to tilt regulations in their favor. Back in 2011, when AT&T and T-Mobile were attempting to gain approval from the Federal Communications Commission for an ultimately doomed $39 billion merger deal, an unusual coalition of interest groups submitted comment to the agency in support of the merger. The NAACP, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, or GLAAD, a homeless shelter in Louisiana, and the Asian Pacific Islander American Scholarship Fund.
The groups were united by two common threads. The first was their lack of any apparent stake in telecommunications policy. The second was the fact that they had all recently received donations from AT&T, in some cases totaling 6 figures or more. And foundations have an enormous influence on nonprofits, on shaping society overall. If you want to scrape the surface on this, watch my video, Bill Gates, King of Neoliberalism. And there's tons of evidence showing how foundations for the last 100 years have been pacifying and co-opting radical social movements. Erica Cole Arenas was on a podcast recently talking about how private foundations funded the California farm worker movement, but wouldn't, quote, support strikes, boycotts, picket lines, unionization, or anything that had to do with confronting the economic structures of agriculture, unquote. And this went on from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s into the early 2000s.
So the poles between self-determination, which was a much more radical sense of self-ownership, and self-help, meaning, well, we won't fund worker collectives, we won't fund land ownership, we won't fund boycotts, but we will fund a service center and a community school, for example. How about that? Would that be okay?
The Revolution Will Not Be Funded book, which is really an anthology of essays, on page 93, there's an essay called Between Radical Theory and Community Praxis, Reflections on Organizing and the Nonprofit Industrial Complex by Amara H. Perez, Sisters in Action for Power.
Over time, funding trends actually come to influence our work, priorities, and direction as we struggle to remain competitive and funded in the movement market. For many activists, this has shifted the focus from strategies for radical change to charts and tables that demonstrate how successfully the work has satisfied foundation-determined benchmarks. Ironically, it's also foundations that most often bring similar social justice groups together from all over the country. And we spend this rare, precious time together walking through the foundation's agendas, meeting their priorities, and contributing to the publications, manuals, and essays they distribute on the field of organizing. Meanwhile, the occasions we do come together to discuss our needs based on our own agendas and without the gaze of funders are few and far between.
In addition to the power and influence of foundation funding, the nonprofit model itself has contributed to the co-optation of our work and institutionalized a structure that has normalized a corporate culture for the way our work is ultimately carried out. In the initial phase, in our efforts to sustain spirit as Sisters in Action for Power, we were overwhelmed with the administrative steps required to become independent. We had to learn to set up accounting programs, a process for paying bills and spending money, legal requirements, insurance, liability, personnel policies, and payroll. We were informed of the need to incorporate as soon as possible and secure our own 501c3. A long list of administrative steps and documents were required, including hundreds of pages of legal credentials, bylaws, articles of incorporation, and other forms and contracts. We registered as a nonprofit organization in a dozen state, city, and county offices. For purposes of staffing, we were expected to produce job descriptions, job announcements, a formal hiring process, and official methods of supervision. And of course, we needed letterhead, business cards, a fax machine, copier, printer, computers, email accounts, and information packets promoting our accomplishments and successes. In the end, the ongoing work to maintain and prospect foundation money combined with administrative obligations and developing infrastructure was more taxing and exhausting than confronting any institution to fight for a policy change.
Oh, this is everybody that did the voiceovers. Thank you, everyone. I think it's like 13 people. Jesus Christ. These talented ass voice people with voices and shit. This one's for the patrons. Oh yeah, I can play guitar, that's right. Ooh, these are like the super patrons, the cool kids or whatever. I can't even spell their names. Dunking on non-profit capitalism. Mary. Get off the computer and do something useful with yourself.